Welcome to the Daily Fantasy Pivot. It's our first show. RotoCurve's bringing you a week. It's actually Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We're going to be coming on from 5 to 6. Joining me here, Josh Kalachi, Ricky Sanders, and Nick Menzio. These guys are fantasy football nerds. I jumped in a little early there, obviously, but we're going to be okay. Thank you for joining us. This is, like I said, the first Daily Fantasy Pivot show from RotoCurve. RotoCurve.com is a daily fantasy news and analysis site that you can find incredible resources. And the most important part is that it's free. You just need to sign up, join us. You'll get exclusive content. There's chats. One of the best things is, I know that I find this is helpful, going into the chat room right before a slate, make sure, check with the group, it's a nice group thing to help, navigate the NBA each night. So we're going to get started, with tonight's slate. The number one thing is we have a $500 free roll on Wednesday night on DraftKings. You're going to want to hit that up. That's the last night. Ricky told us that there's no such thing as a bad NBA slate, but Thursday disagrees. So we're going to want to jump in and get a lot of shares, get a lot of games in on Wednesday, because we're going to have a week break basically with the All-Star game. So, when I was a kid, the All-Star game was awesome. Now it's kind of this awful break for DFS. So we're going to get started. Now, injury notes, guys. We were talking about this before the show. There's not really a ton of impactful injury news, it seems like, outside of maybe Tobias Harris, we mentioned, has some influence, right, with Orlando. We're not really sure about his status. There isn't great information. There hasn't been an update today, it seems. Kevin Love is playing. We also have D'Angelo Russell has a sore groin, also a bruised ego. So he's going to be an issue. And then that really seems like the big ones. Marc Gasol rather, is also dinged up. So we're going to have to figure out what we do there if he's out. That Ricky had mentioned that maybe helps out, Zach Randolph's stock. But what we're going to do with the show is actually get into, our picks for the day. We're going to go into starting with the point guard position, obviously. And as is the case in the NBA today, it's a point guard driven league. It's where you rack up a ton of your value in terms of these guys always have the ball in their hands, high usage guys. So Josh, I know Ricky had mentioned, the Bulls being a great play. But who are your point guards, Josh, that you're trying to build around? I know we have that great Kings-Cavs matchup, but who are some guys that you're building around? And then maybe if you can, just start off real quick and explain the difference between when you say that you like a guy in cash and then you like a guy in GPP or tournaments. What does that mean?
Well, it's a perfect way to bring that in, because my top cash point guard tonight is a guy by the name of Rajon Rondo, who we all like basically at one point or another. And the difference between cash games and GPP, for those of you who don't know, cash games are 50-50s and head-to-heads, and GPPs are the big tournaments where people like to play. And it's usually just top 18 to 21% of people that cash in these tournaments, but there are higher prize pools. And the thing with cash games is just your top 50% where you have a chance to double your money minus the 10% that they take off, which is called rate. So if you play a $1 50-50, you'll cash back $1.80, $5 for $9, so on and so forth. But what I mean with Rondo in cash games, as opposed to potentially being in GPPs, is the guy usually has a high floor, but sometimes his ceiling is limited. Now, it depends on how certain guys look at in terms of stats and what they do for statistics and stuff. For what Rondo does, he doesn't score very much, but he does rebound for a guard. He gets a ton of assists. He has the most 15 assist games in the NBA this year. And the one reason why I like him a lot tonight is he has a great matchup against Kyrie Irving, who's an excellent offensive player, but he really struggles on the defensive side of the ball. In addition, that game is very fast-paced. And what we mean by that is there's going to be more possessions, more shots. And for a guy that holds the ball pretty much over 50% of the time for the Kings, having a guy in a fast-paced game is definitely something I want to look for cash, because he quote-unquote checks all the boxes.
Well, let me weigh in on that, since I'm the rotations guy here. And I think one injury we didn't really talk about was Rudy Gay. And when we talk about rotations, a team, plays their guys differently when there's different people active, and they run a different sort of way. So we're talking about Marc Gasol later, and when he's out, Zach Randolph becomes their main rebounder, and maybe they use some smaller lineups, maybe they use some other guys. Well, the Kings without Rudy Gay, I think Rondo actually becomes a better player, because now he has more of an opportunity, especially in fantasy. He has more of an opportunity for assists. And I'm looking at his assist percentage, which is a number you don't necessarily have to know if you're, a beginner. But his assist percentage goes up without Rudy Gay, because he's one of those guys you dump the ball to and he makes a one-on-one move. And same thing with rebound percentage, because there's more opportunities for him as a smaller guy to grab some rebounds without one of the bigger players on. Guys like Marco Bellinelli, who are smaller, might play those minutes instead. So I think Rondo benefits from their rotation without Gay, and I think that makes him a better play.
Now, when you say rebounding percentage and assist percentage, just for the crowd, I mean, you're talking about that's a per possession rate, right? So you're talking about the rebound percentage is the percentage of available rebounds you're getting.
Yeah, the percentage of rebounds he gets when he's on the floor, basically. Exactly.
Okay, so Nick, what's your take on the point guard slate? It's just a big slate. You got 20 teams in play. What do you see initially when you look at the point guard position?
I think I'm looking at 3 guys. The dude opposite of Rondo, Irving, for sure. I love him. His upside's huge. I love point guards that are way up in pace. I mean, the Cavs are playing a lot faster now with Tyronn Lue as coach, but I love Irving in this game. And then Russell Westbrook, if you want to pay up, I know there's blowout factor there with the huge spread, so we don't know how many minutes he's going to get, but if you're paying up, I love him a lot because the Suns are just terrible against guards. And then Derrick Rose is like almost a must-play without Jimmy Butler in the lineup, so I love all 3 of those guys.
Right, so that's one of the things that they notice, when somebody like Jimmy Butler, obviously this, high usage guy, at least in terms of, his shot usage, when he goes out, is that something that now we automatically should appreciate Rose more? And is there anybody else, obviously does Brooks or anybody else get any extra shine, or is that something that, maybe it'll push it to the shooting guard position like more or something like that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ricky.
I'll answer it. Is that I think without Jimmy Butler, they basically become the Oklahoma City Thunder. In terms of their production goes through mostly 2 guys. I think Pau Gasol, especially without Joakim Noah, and Derrick Rose are so reliable tonight. And I'm basically sounding like a homer on our first podcast. And usually I'm very doom and gloom when it comes to the Bulls. But honestly, I mean, Derrick Rose, 42.5, 54.25, and 41.25 are his last 3 games of fantasy point totals. I mean, I went back and looked at Gasol versus the Hornets the last few times. He's been a monster. Now he doesn't have Joakim Noah, so we talked about rebound percentage. I think that's going up. I think you're getting 40 fantasy points from both these guys, and I think they're very predictable. So without Butler, I think E'Twaun Moore is going to step in. He's been playing some big minutes, but he's kind of a shooter. He's kind of volatile. We've got Mike Dunleavy back, so I kind of worry about him. But I think Rose and Gasol are locks, and everyone else is kind of, game to game according to how Hoiberg wants to use them.
Well, adding to your point there, Ricky, is I was just looking at the Bulls, and just when you go on the site called NBA Wowie, you can look at on-off stats, and I think we can all agree that on-off stats are very important in the NBA, especially FS, because as Ricky said before, rotations change, roles change, and of course, usage rate change. And what usage rate is essentially how many plays end with the guy taking a shot or making a pass, something of that nature. But basically, usage implies shooting. And like Ricky just said, that's a 2-man game. Between Derrick Rose and Pau Gasol, they have a usage combined of 62%. So basically out of every, say they take 70 shots, around 40 of those shots or more are going to be from Rose and Pau Gasol. And that's exactly what you need to look for in cash game, because you're looking at guys who are going to take a lot of shots. In addition, they can get rebounds and assists as well. That's exactly what you're looking for, guys that can score in multiple areas and categories.
How do you guys navigate, matchups? I mean, on the site, for example, we have the free tool. We have a DVP tool. So, Josh, I mean, I know you helped, organize that tool and produce those metrics. So how do we appreciate matchups? I think that's something that's difficult for people in fantasy basketball to grasp sometimes, because the league moves so quickly in terms of you're at the next game. We don't have that week like the NFL to build up and analyze one matchup. So how do you guys, starting with Josh, first of all, explain DVP a little bit if you can, and then also get into what are the factors really that you look for in matchups? Do you look for team allowances, to the position? What are the indicators you use?
Well, looking at matchups, the first thing you want to look at is a stat called DVP, which is defense versus position. Now, there are a lot of different ways to look at it, because sometimes they are misleading, because some guys can be listed at shooting guard or small forward, like, for example, a guy we'll talk about later, Nicholas Batum. He is starting at small forward on terms of some sites like FanDuel, DraftKings, and Fantasy Draft. But the thing is, he plays a lot of two guard, shooting guard. And what we look at for that is if you know that, sometimes that comes between acquiring knowledge, watching the NBA games, or just studying rotations. You can use that to your advantage because, like I just said, Nicholas Batum is essentially a shooting guard on offense for the most part for the Charlotte Hornets. So you would use that and look at how his opponent tonight in the Chicago Bulls would be against shooting guards. Now, another thing you can use matchups for is individual matchups. There are guys like Avery Bradley for the Boston Celtics that play shooting guard, but essentially he guards the other team's point guard.
Mhm.
It's a big reason why they're actually very good against opposing point guards. So some guys guard certain positions, some guys guard others. But for the most part, DVP, which is defense first position, really matches up well. Like everyone knows basically Pau Gasol is a center,
Mhm.
knows that Kemba Walker is a point guard. Usually the point guard or how a opposing team does against a point guard or a center matches up in DVP. And that's exactly what our tool shows on the right-hand side, those rankings 1 through 30.
So, Ricky, how do you go about, analyzing matchups and what kind of actionable information do you like to lean on more than others?
I like pace. I like team
Okay.
pace. I like
So that's possessions per 48 minutes for teams. Right.
Yeah, I like how quickly the game's going to move because
Right.
a lot of times, defense versus position is nice, but it doesn't matter in some cases if we're going with a fast-paced game. I mean, you talk about the Rockets versus anyone, and this is what I noticed that they do is James Harden will take the ball up, and let's say he's got a great defender on him. Well, he'll run off the ball, they'll screen him, and they'll make sure they switch onto the guy that he wants to take, and then they'll take it to the house. So you spend all this time analyzing the matchup and saying, oh man, they're great against shooting guards, and Harden's switching off screens all day onto their worst defender and taking him to the house, and all of a sudden he ends up with 60 fantasy points, and you're like, why the hell did that happen? But it was a fast-paced game, so there was a lot of opportunities for him to pass the ball, rebound the ball, score the ball, and I love looking for guys that are on slower paced teams that are playing faster paced teams that are going to be forced to play at a faster pace than they're used to. A lot of guys you'll look at like the Warriors of the world. Now Steph Curry's 11,000 every time. He's priced like the Warriors are going to run the ball. DeMarcus Cousins is priced like they're going to run it. But all of a sudden, you're looking at a lesser team like the Pacers or let's even say the Utah Jazz, since they're as slow as it gets. All of a sudden, they play a team like the Warriors who's going to push up and down the court. Rudy Gobert's priced like it's going to be, an 80 to 84 game.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they're going to have to score 100 points to have a shot against the Warriors. I love that added production. I like looking at pace almost as much as I like, looking at individual matchup.
Okay, Nick, what are some of the identifiable things you look for? And then also, we're going to start getting into actually naming some we'll get into this point guard position a little bit more specific, obviously. So if you can start off, not just what your preferences are for identifying matchups, but also who are the point guards that you like tonight specifically in the value sense, not just the top guys, but guys maybe below, the more expensive tiers.
I mean, the first thing I do every morning is I look at the Vegas totals and pace. Like those are the two main things I look at consistently every day. And then I'll use DVP as a tiebreaker between some guys. I mean, I don't weigh DVP too much, but if there's a team that's really horrible against like guards or centers, I'll look heavily into that player facing that team. But for point guard value, I like Emmanuel Mudiay tonight,
Okay.
especially with Jameer Nelson still out. I mean, he's playing a ton of minutes. And then Norris Cole for GPPs. I mean, his minutes are just all over the place a little bit. I mean, the other day he only played like 8 minutes, I think, because he turned the ball over 3 times against the Lakers on Thursday, I believe. But his minutes came back up to 32 the other day. So I like him in that matchup against the T-Wolves tonight.
Josh, who are some value plays that you're identifying tonight at the point guard spot?
The first guy is actually the guy Nick just mentioned as well. Is I really like Emmanuel Mudiay as well, simply because of that matchup we talked about against Brooklyn. Donald Sloan, Shane Larkin, and it really doesn't matter between the two of them. Neither one of them can defend. And as Nick said, with the fact that Jameer Nelson is out again, looks like he's going to be out through the All-Star break. Mudiay is getting 32, 33, sometimes even 38 minutes. And a stat that I like to look at a lot in terms of efficiency is FanDuel, DraftKings, or just really in general fantasy points per minute. And with Mudiay, he's getting 0.08 this year, and just simple math, taking 0.08 times 32 or more, and looking at a guy that can get 27, 28 FanDuel points, maybe even 30 DraftKings points, because you only lose a half a point for a turnover on that site. And it is priced just above 5,000 on most sites. You're returning 6 times value. What I mean by 6 times value, if a guy costs 5,000, 30 points would be 6 times that 5. But basically, what we look for is between 5 and 6 times the salary for a player to reach value. Does anybody have anything else to add on what value means and how it can be applied to certain slates?
Yeah, I mean,
I think you covered it.
yeah, I think you covered it. I think it depends on the slate. I mean, when you look at smaller nights, sometimes value is a little overvalued. We've argued about this before, but basically you're looking at a night where you're going to need 240 on a 3-game slate, 240 fantasy points on DraftKings or Fantasy Draft or one of those sites versus a bigger slate. So I think it's kind of a fluctuating thing. Basically, when you're looking for a value play, you want some form of multiplier. You got to do a little bit of math in your head, but DraftKings, you figure if your target score for that night is 300, you've got $50,000 to spend. You look at a player, you want 6 times the value. So if a guy is 5,900, you go 5.9 times 6 equals what is he going to get there? What are the odds of him going to get there? It's a little bit of math, but again, I caution using it too much because it could change from slate to slate.
Okay. If you guys are comfortable with the point guard breakdown, are there any point guards that we haven't mentioned? Basically what we're saying is we like Moutier for value. We like paying up a little bit more here for Rose is reasonable, but then of the high dollar guys, I think some people are naturally attracted to spend a lot of point guards. So if somebody was to spend between Lowry, Chris Paul, and Westbrook, I mean, really Westbrook is a whole different tier. But let's just say between Lowry and Paul, I know it's a more expensive name. We're going to go to some more value plays that Ricky likes. But Ricky, just for you, like between Paul and Lowry, is there what's the differentiation angle there?
I like Chris Paul. I think Chris Paul is probably one of the safest bets on the slate. I think outside of maybe the top guys or Pau Gasol, he's your safest bet for 40 fantasy points tonight. I don't think this Clipper team is so great without Blake Griffin. I think we're looking at, another team that goes through mostly 2 guys, Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan. He has a great history versus Philadelphia. I don't think it's such a guaranteed blowout against them. I think Chris Paul's a lock for a double-double. The great thing about Philadelphia is they turn the ball over more than just about anyone else. I actually think they're dead last now. So Chris Paul, has been a steals machine for years. I love Chris Paul. I think you could pay up for Westbrook. I'm a little worried about a blowout, and I think there are other guys that could get you comparable totals, assuming he doesn't play his full minutes. He just basically had a track meet. So I'm kind of going to avoid Westbrook for that 11,300 price on DraftKings. And I wanted to mention a few other value guys that we didn't get to. Darren Collison's one of my favorite guys. We talked about rotation, and this is a weird case, and I don't think George Karl's much longer. I think we can agree on this. Yeah. I think this does take a little bit of cojones because it's a little bit of a shot in Darren Collison because his minutes fluctuate a little bit, but without Ben McLemore, who's kind of an under the radar, we haven't talked about him yet. Darren Collison, they've played a lot of lineups with Rondo next to Collison, and Collison's put up 24.5 fantasy points in 3 straight, and he's gone at least 29 minutes in 3 of the last 4, and his minutes are basically hovering around 30 without Ben McLemore. So we're talking about a guy who's going to play, a lot. Omri Cassie's a little bit in the doghouse right now, so he's not just flat stepping in for, Rudy Gay. I think they're kind of concocting different lineups, and I think Collison's actually making do with the minutes he's being given.
Now, Nick, what's your approach to Westbrook tonight? Because I think that's going to be, a big entry point. And then after that, if you don't have any more, that's great. But if you have any other value plays past Moutier, feel free to mention them.
Westbrook, I think he's the number 1 guy to pay up for tonight. Anthony Davis might be that guy, but I just cannot. I hate playing Anthony Davis in cash because he gets hurt. It seems every 2 games. You
fear that tweet that he goes to the locker room.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But there's so much value at point guard tonight. So if you don't want to pay up for Westbrook, I think Durant would probably be the next guy. Kevin Durant, his teammate, obviously.
The high-end guys. Okay. And now Josh, same question. And then we'll move in. I'm sorry, Nick. If you do have any value guys, I cut you off there. Do you have any other value guys to consider? Or is it really?
I said Moutier and Norris Cole, and then Archie Goodwin.
Gotcha.
Is another cheap guy I like against the Thunder because Westbrook's not a great defender. So I like that play.
Right now, Josh, like you were shaking your head there. It seemed like an agreement with Westbrook. What's your take on building around Westbrook? Because he's one of these players. He's on DraftKings, for example. He's like 23% of your budget. So
Yeah, it's tough on sites like DraftKings that do have tighter pricing. I'm sure we can all agree on that. But sites like FanDuel and Fantasy Draft, you can kind of afford a little bit more. So
Yep.
you can go for some value guys in one slot. I know in FanDuel there are two point guard spots. It's pretty much everywhere except for center, where you can pay up for a guy like Westbrook, but then get Moutier for around 5,400 as well. But yeah, I think that pretty much rounds it up for point guards. Anybody else have anything else to add there?
Yeah, I want to add Jeff Teague, who dropped 25 and 5 in literally the identical matchup yesterday. I want to add Mike Conley, especially if Marcus Gasol's out. He's really, really boring, but I think his minutes have got to go up. And he has been averaging over 31 minutes since his return. So, he's playing, and even though it seemed like Chalmers was a threat to his minutes for a while, that's no longer the case. We mentioned Norris Cole. I actually think he's a very solid play today. His minutes have been fluctuating, but he's better in faster paced games, and Minnesota struggles against point guards. And I want to mention Kemba Walker against the Bulls. Derrick Rose has been playing some serious minutes lately. His knees are not the same.
yeah,
I don't think he can compete with Kemba Walker's speed.
I think Derrick Rose is like 88th in defensive real plus minus.
Yeah.
Point guard out of 92 eligible guys. So we're going to move on to shooting guard here and start breaking down this position, a little bit more shallow position. Generally, it's arguably the most shallow position in the league in real NBA as well. But we'll start off with Nick's takes here on shooting guard. He had mentioned J.R. Smith, but before you get into J.R. Smith, I also wanted to ask you, Nick, in terms of we've been talking about different fantasy sites, and so I think something that can be confusing for somebody is if somebody can be really, a play that you like, a value on one site, and then on another site, it's somebody that you're not interested based on pricing and matchups, or it's more pricing, but how do you navigate picking between different sites and kind of evaluating them with kind of a different eye, because maybe you look at the slate and then you have an idea about a player. How does that change from site to site?
Well, to be honest, I only play on one site, FanDuel, because I can't juggle sites like that. I just takes too much. I feel like my play suffers on FanDuel if I do that. So
because you're seeing too much pricing, right? Too many different. It's too much noise. Okay.
Yeah, too much noise, too much clutter. So I like to stick to one spot and play there. So FanDuel is my spot. And then you have to play two shooting guards there, obviously, unlike DraftKings where you only have to play one. So it's just the shallowest position every night. I think there's a ton of volatility there. So I guess tonight, like I said in the open, I love J.R. Smith a lot in this fast-paced game. Kings can't defend anyone. They just gave up a ton of points in the first quarter to the Celtics yesterday and in the first half in total. So I just think the Cavs are just going to be running all over them. But I love him, and then I love Jamal Crawford against the Sixers. I think he's just so consistent right now. He carries that second uniform, plays a ton of minutes for the first unit next to Chris Paul. He's an elite scorer in this league, just from a pure scoring the basketball standpoint. So I love him against the Sixers.
Now, Ricky, who are some shooting guards? I know that you were big on that Kings game, the Cavs game, but you also said you like the Bulls a lot. I don't know if there's if you like more from there. You mentioned him, but who are the shooting guards you like? And then also, I know that with fantasy draft, what are some of your strategies for navigating different sites?
Well, kind of figuring out the pricing is the main one, because prices really do matter. You might really look at a guy on that night and say, I really like him, say like a Pau Gasol. And then all of a sudden you go to DraftKings and he's, 20% of your budget. You can't do it unless you really think he's a lock for 50 fantasy points. So I think understanding the different pricing systems, and when it comes to fantasy draft, usually it's comparable to DraftKings with some of the top players and even mid-tier players slightly cheaper, so you can fit more talent and more flexible rosters on fantasy draft, as opposed to DraftKings, where I think where in fantasy draft it makes more sense to start with your expensive guys because you know who you're locking in. On DraftKings, it makes more sense to start with your value guys to lock them in and then see what you can fit around them, because sometimes you'll love a Russell Westbrook, but what are you going to play with them? You need someone who's 3,000 to 4,000 and there's no one that's going to eclipse 12 fantasy points. Well, then you almost can't do it unless it's a smaller slate. But some of the shooting guards I like tonight, I wonder if Josh is going to say something about this, because he hates pure shooters, and I got a lot of pure shooters that I like tonight. Jamal Crawford, definitely up there. I mean, I think he's the cream of the crop value play of the night. He's been great without Blake Griffin, scored 20 real points in 4 straight, so lock him in. If you want to get a little more expensive, I kind of believe in this Kobe Bryant breakout recently. I think he's feeling good. I mean, this is his farewell tour. He scored at least 23 real points in 4 straight. And if there's one thing I know about Kobe, it's when he's on the floor, he's going to be shooting. So even if he misses his first 5 shots, you almost can't worry about him because he's going to take 15, 20 more.
There's no conscience.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a good matchup. So I'm sticking with Bryant. And Archie Goodwin, he qualifies at shooting guard for whatever reason on DraftKings, but he's been playing really close to 40 minutes. He's had a couple letdowns down the way, but this is a fast-paced game. I think, against Russell Westbrook, you're going to have your best pure ball handler against him for most of the game. So I think Goodwin plays an extended number of minutes, if you can even call it that, because he's been playing so much. And another pure scorer, I'm waiting on the status of Alan Crabb, but you could even go slightly less expensive than Jamal Crawford if Crabb sits. It's a bad matchup against, I believe, Memphis, but Gerald Henderson, near minimum. He's kind of crept up a little bit in price, but I think he's usable, especially if he's going to see those extra guaranteed without Crabb.
Well, Josh, what's your take on this market? And then also something that Ricky touched on is guys that are near kind of the pricing floor, and that become popular. So who are the guys that, how do you navigate different sites, first of all? But then if you don't mind, get into some guys, the risk of taking somebody near the pricing floor. And sometimes what happens is a guy like Henderson becomes really popular, or somebody's 3,200 or 3,300 on DraftKings, for example, and becomes very popular. How do you navigate using a guy that almost everybody is on?
Yeah, first things first is I just wanted to take a chance and there's one quick piece of news. Ish Smith, for those of you that are using him, it will start tonight, but he is just on a 25-minute restriction. So to me, I think that takes him off the board because at 25 minutes, you're expecting him to get an incredible amount of efficiency. And he's going against Chris Paul, who's notoriously one of the better defenders.
Does that do anything for McConnell or Cannon or anything, or is it just leave that alone?
I think McConnell will probably pick up an additional 6 to 7 minutes, but once again, he's a guy that doesn't shoot much. So if anything, he would be a cash game floor play. But with all the other options, I think I'm just going to stay away against a guy like Chris Paul.
Okay, now with shooting guard, who are some of the guys that you're targeting? Rick had mentioned that he likes Kobe, and Nick's on J.R. Smith. Who's the guy that you identify, or a few of the guys that you identify right away as that you're attracted to at this shallow position?
The first guy that popped out to me, is, like Nick said, is Jamal Crawford, who I think we're all in agreement are.
Gotcha.
I also like E'Twaun Moore, and I think Ricky can attest that he's 3-Twan Moore of late, just scoring all kinds of points. And the one thing with him is you have to look at what he's done without Jimmy Butler. In the last 3 games without Butler, and I have a comment about the second game, he's had 39, 11.6, and 29.9 FanDuel points. But the middle game is something to worry about. When you saw 11.6, Butler did play that game. He did leave early after a nasty fall, but he played 18 or 19 minutes. So that changes the role a little bit, and Moore did only have that second half to really play in that specific role. So in the 2 games with Butler completely on the shelf, Moore has shown his ability to really contribute in scoring. He actually had a couple rebounds and assists in that last game as well. So he's a guy I like to look at. And in addition, we always talked about pace so far on the show, and a guy that's playing in a very fast-paced game tonight is Devin Booker for the Phoenix Suns against the Oklahoma City Thunder. And the one thing I want to talk about with shooting guards against the Thunder is when you look at DVP, when you look at the matchups and stuff like that, you will see that Oklahoma City is relatively good against shooting guards. But that's because of Andre Roberson. Roberson has not played of late. He's out for, I believe, another 3 to 4 weeks. Dion Waiters has been the guy playing 36 or more minutes in that spot. He's not a good defender. He's not a good shooter, not a good dribbler, but that's a story for another day. But the thing is, he just cannot defend. And a guy like Booker, who's been playing 35 to 40 minutes minimum, he takes a ton of shots. And as Ricky alluded to, I don't love volume shooters, but a guy that's taking close to 20 shots is worth using because even if you only make 7, you're looking at 15 points before any of the secondary stats.
Now, one quick thing is we're mentioning pace a lot, and I feel like people understand it. We're talking about the speed of the game, a higher pace, more possessions. It's just something, if you want to check out, it's one of the free tools we have. It's a game theory tool on RotoCurve. You can check it out. And what it does is it combines the value that we find between the Vegas spread, the over-under, you want a high point total, and then also, in regards to pace. I just had a quick question for Nick. Is there any, when you're looking at when you say you open up and you look at totals and stuff like that, Is there kind of a number in your head that you're searching for that seems like a value point? You know, I know like in the NFL, for example, you want something over 46. Is there anything that you're interested? Is there kind of a number in your head that you're using when you're looking at this stuff, or is it contextual to the day?
I mean, I think anything over 210, 215 is like amazing. I'll target any games like that. Like tonight, we have a 219 between the Kings and the Cavs. I mean, this is from this morning, so I don't know if it's changed a little bit, but anyway, it's going to be right around there. And then we have a 210 in New Orleans at Minnesota, and then a 215.5 between OKC and Phoenix. So those are just 3 really high-paced games that I'm really looking forward to get some action on.
Okay. Now, just this is a final call to action. Are there any shooting guards that you guys feel merit a little bit more attention that we haven't, you know, discussed their value or their fade? I mean, there's also guys maybe that we wouldn't want to play. Anything like any guys that you can mention that you're targeting and/or fading?
Yes, I want to start there. If Tobias Harris is out, and I don't know if you guys have seen anything about that yet, again, it's really strange, but Orlando and Atlanta are playing each other again for the second straight day. Evan Fournier lit them up yesterday. He is much better without Tobias Harris on the court. We're talking about 0.73 fantasy points a minute with Tobias and 0.88 without him. Again, you can find that stat on NBA Wowie. It just shows how efficient they are, you know, with guys on and off. But Fournier would start, and he would play a big allotment of minutes, so I think he deserves some consideration the day after. And Marco Bellinelli, guy I kind of like. He faces the Cavs team that's, you know, okay on defense, but I like these numbers. 2 games without McLemore, he's averaging 29.6 fantasy points, which is a little bit misleading because he's had 1 good game and 1 bad game. But what I like is the minutes have been there, and he only averaged 17.5 fantasy points with McLemore for the season, so that's clearly an uptick. And we should mention Bryce DeJon-Jones for FanDuel only because he's the minimum there. But on DraftKings, his price has gotten too much for me.
Josh, anybody that you haven't mentioned a shooting guard, or you feel comfortable with the range of options that we've discussed?
I just literally could mirror exactly what Ricky said about Evan Fournier, especially with Harrison. And I wanted to touch on one quick thing before is
Sure.
we were talking about pace, and Nick mentioned the teams with the high totals. That's something we should all target. And the one reason is if there's more points, there's more assists, there's more rebounds.
Mhm.
Yep.
It's just everything is increases, and you'll notice a trend when you play daily fantasy basketball. If you look at games between the Jazz and the Grizzlies, you're only going to see maybe a 90 to 86 game.
Mhm.
But looking at games between the Suns, the Thunder, the Warriors, there's actually a lot more fast-paced teams now, which I think is a trend that we're going to be seeing for a long time. If you see games at 215, 220, we even saw a game. What was it, 231 the other night?
The Thunder game was 231, right?
Yeah, and those are the games you want to target because the more points there are, the more assists there are, the more fantasy points there are, and that's what we're all here for.
Now, this is one quick question for you guys is about, you know, coaching changes. You know, today, for example, we saw Fisher was dismissed with the Knicks. We'll move on in a second to the next position, but this is something I think is interesting because, you know, we see the Suns, we saw Hornacek out. Every situation is different, but how do you guys approach these coaching changes? Do you have to let kind of the rotations settle out in the first couple of games to have your take, or is there value sometimes to be had jumping in a little bit early, maybe if you can assume a shift in usage or anything for certain players?
I'll take this one, and Kalachi and I have talked about this. A lot of times with a coaching change for the first few games, I like to go with what I would do if I were the coach. I like to see what the coach was doing wrong,
Right.
and say, if Ricky were coaching the team, what would happen? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's left for tournaments, but something like the Knicks, where they haven't been running, you know, Jerry and Grant nearly enough as a young player for a team that's maybe, you know, not really a championship contender this year. Maybe Jerry and Grant see some extended minutes. You know, maybe Derek Williams sees some extended minutes, something like that. I think you can kind of project a little bit, but like in Earl Watson's case, he's been pretty forward with what he was going to do. Sometimes coaches lie, but basically from the start, he said that Markieff Morris is my star, Devin Booker's going to be a superstar, and he's kind of acted accordingly. So you got to listen to what the coaches say, determine whether or not you believe them, and act on that. But I think it's, you know, it's difference of opinion on what you think should happen and what is happening. And, you know, if you're not sure, if you're new to the game, you can always ask one of us on Twitter what we think should be changing.
Nick, what's your take on coaching changes? I mean, we've already experienced a few this year. There could be a couple more. Is there anything, you know, to add to it, you know, to Ricky's, you know, take on that?
Ricky's a little more bold with it. He likes to play. I like to tackle.
You don't do Coach Nick. You don't go into Coach Nick mode.
No Coach Nick mode. I just take the wait and see approach for a game or two, and unless it's just like a crazy good matchup from beforehand, I'll play it. But I like to take the wait and see.
Josh, how about you? Is there anything you take away from these shifts? Because the Knicks, for example, like Ricky said, they're a team that has a few young guys that might benefit from more exposure.
Yeah, and the one thing to note with these coaching changes is I know when we were growing up, I know myself especially, when we watched why do coaches do certain things, you always thought, well, you know what? They're in the NBA, so they must know. Right. The older we get, the more we realize that's not necessarily. I mean, we're seeing guys like just the Lakers, for example. Kobe Bryant will be 1 for 71 from the floor. He's taking the last shot, regardless of who else is hot on the court. So I think the one thing to take an approach is what Ricky was saying. Think about what you would do, but also, like what Nick said, I'm more of a guy to take a wait-and-see approach. You guys will learn that I'm probably one of the most conservative people in the history of BFS. But the thing is, with that, if you take a wait-and-see approach and you miss them on one night, that's fine. You will know that what the rotation is going forward. And one quick piece of news, Roy Hibbert is out tonight. I wouldn't recommend him using him anyway, but that does mean that Julius Randle will probably be playing center for well over 28 minutes tonight.
Yeah, and the Lakers' issues stretch much beyond Kobe taking that shot. Getting Roy Hibbert out of the starting lineup tonight should help. There's no reason he should have been there in the first place. And extended minutes for Julius Randle, please.
Yeah, why would you ever want to play your young rising stars? So let's move on to small forward. I feel like we're pretty comfortable with shooting guard. The small forward position, it's full of superstars. It's one of the superstar positions in the NBA. Tonight we have Durant, Kevin Durant playing. We have LeBron James, Paul George, and then there's a series of other strong, high usage small forwards. Nick, who's your choice for the strong plays that you're building around, on the high dollar end of small forward?
I think if I was going to pick one guy from the high end, it would be Durant, but I just don't think I'm going to pay up at that position too high.
Okay.
But
where are you going to go then? Instead of pivoting off of that higher tier, what are you approaching?
I know Josh likes Nick Batum, and I'm on that train as well. I love Batum in this matchup against the Bulls. The Bulls are terrible against small forwards, even if he's playing shooting guard, Jimmy Butler's out. That defense of Jimmy Butler would be a thing to monitor, but we don't have to worry about that tonight. So I think Batum's a really strong play. And then Stanley Johnson is a small forward on FanDuel. I don't know if he's listed somewhere else on other sites, but I think he's still a strong play starting for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who's still out through the All-Star break. Even in a tough match against the Raptors, down in pace, still think he's too underpriced to ignore.
Now, Josh, at the wing here, at the three, who are the guys that you're targeting, and is there anybody that is a really strong value that you think you just have to take the savings on?
I think especially on FanDuel with his price is Stanley Johnson, as Nick just mentioned. I also like Batum and Johnson. Those are probably going to be my two guys in cash games on FanDuel tonight, simply because of their floor, the minutes they're getting. Both guys have been shooting a lot more as well. And the one thing with Stanley Johnson is he could have a tough matchup against Toronto, who is a good defending team, but he's played 44 and 38 minutes in his two games as a starter without KCP, who is Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And the one thing about Stanley Johnson is, like KCP, he's a decent defender. He's an athletic guy that's playing the through. But the thing is with Stanley Johnson is he can shoot a little bit, and he's not afraid to do that. Caldwell-Pope's shooting percentage was up this year, but he didn't really seem to take more than 8 to 10 shots at most. And Stanley Johnson has actually taken that under the wing and just begin to increase his usage, especially in those minutes he's seen lately.
Ricky, what's your take here on this position?
I got a slightly different take, but first I want to bring in a little bit of news.
Sure.
Robert Sacre is starting tonight. Had many extended conversations about this guy, Kalachi, but Robert Sacre will be making his triumphant return back to fantasy relevance. He's about a 0.3 fantasy point a minute producer, but he will be starting. So all you Robert Sacre fans, congratulations. But back to small forward, I'm going to go LeBron James tonight. I'm paying up for him.
Okay.
I mean, this Kings team is horrible. And, I would have liked him better without Kevin Love. I'm not going to lie. But I'm not going to let the Kevin Love factor deter me, basically. I think he's got the same kind of upside as Russell Westbrook tonight, and he's going to be cheaper because, I mean, you're looking at a guy 34% usage when Love's off the court, but we're not exactly looking at a schlub when he's on. I mean, 32.4. We know Braun gives you the boards, the assists, the scoring. He'll give you defensive stats. He shoots threes. He does literally everything. He's facing a terrible defense. Even if they blow him out, I mean, I think 3/4 of LeBron James is going to be more than enough. I mean, Sacramento's allowed 104 points in 8 straight games, at least 104. So I think you're getting a ton of production from the Cleveland staples tonight. You guys mentioned Stanley Johnson. I like Marcus Morris tonight.
Okay.
He's kind of been under the radar the last few games. I mean, with everyone paying up for Stanley, and trust me, I get it. I love this kid. Like LeBron, he's got, upside all across the board. Not quite the passer, but this kid's going to be a nice when he develops. But Marcus Morris, 26.5 and 27 fantasy points in 2 games without KCP. I mean, he's going to pick up some of the slack and some of the minutes. Stan Van Gundy, not a guy that's shy to play his starters big minutes unless your name's Ersan Ilyasova, who he kind of plays with his minutes. But I like Stanley and Marcus. You guys mentioned Batum. I do like Kent Bazemore, who's small forward eligible. Again, a guy who I think you might be paying for yesterday's points if you use him, but he's still cheap. He did go 23 and 8 in Orlando. I think he had 8 assists the game before. And how about Michael Kidd-Gilchrist? You guys mentioned Batum. I really like Kidd-Gilchrist. The Bulls are one of the best rebounding teams, but opposing centers and opposing small forwards rank in the top 5 of rebounding against them. I think this is one of those games where Kidd-Gilchrist is just what's the word I want? He's aggressive, and the Bulls are not good against, Pau Gasol's lazy. Taj Gibson tries to be aggressive, but he's a smaller player. So I think Kidd-Gilchrist is going to be aggressive on both offense and defense. I think he's going to get easy offensive rebounds. I think he's going to get easy defensive rebounds just for Pau Gasol sleeping and, having to take up more of the offense. So I think Kidd-Gilchrist, everyone's looking at Batum, but 5,400, I think we get something like 11 and 11, maybe a block. And Wesley Johnson, I like as well.
Now, here's a question too. We talked about Tobias Harris. We've talked about some questionable guys. Do you write guys off that are injured heading in, or are you really just taking it based on the status? Like Nick, if somebody like Tobias Harris, not to say that he's a play that we're interested in, but a guy who's questionable, does that really affect your interest in a guy? A guy's status?
I think
questionable. Do you fade him a little bit more, or do you really just take it based on if the guy's starting or not?
For tournaments, I think if you see that game time decision, little mark next to him or questionable tag next to him on FanDuel, how I look at it, I think people will just bypass those guys and not use them. So I think it's like a great way to use them in tournaments because they'll be so low owned. So
it filters out all those players. It'll just avoid those players, right? Avoid that injury. Okay.
Right. So I think they're awesome tournament plays if you see a guy that's injured and he's going to play.
Okay. It seems like small forwards fairly well covered. Does anybody want to touch on any other small forwards that we haven't covered? It seems like we have a pretty wide array of options here.
Yeah, I want to touch on one.
I like Jeff Green.
Yeah,
okay,
Yep. Go ahead, Nick. That's where I was going.
Especially if Gasol's out, but even if he's not out, he's taking on more of a scoring threat or scoring option, number 2 guy in that offense for scoring. And even if the Blazers are a pretty long team, like especially with Aminu at the 3, but I still like Green. He's an awesome scorer, can do rebounds, steals, and he's hot right now. So I love that play and that price too.
So guys,
and he's up in pace.
Guys who have
against a terrible defense.
There you go. Guys like Green who have higher variance, kind of, in their outcomes. Does that affect whether you're going to use that player in cash or GPP? Are you more interested in those kind of players in tournaments, or in terms of the volatility factor of certain players? Like, how do you approach volatility, Ricky?
Yeah, it depends how confident you are that that's going to be one of their volatile good games.
Okay.
I mean, like Nerlens Noel's one of those players, one of my favorite players in the league, and you kind of know it's going to be volatile good when Jahlil Okafor sits out because he can kind of play more of his game. Or maybe you see a fast-paced game that you think there's just going to be a lot of rebounding block opportunities. Maybe he's playing, a team that Hoop Stats, by the way, one of my favorite sites, one of the teams that's blocked the most of any team at the power forward and center positions. You know what you're getting. But for the most part, I think the volatile players, we all would agree, are best left for tournaments, unless you're talking about, a guy who has somewhat volatile of one of his stats, meaning every once in a while CJ McCollum will, pull out a 10 assists game or something like that, but his scoring is pretty consistent. So it depends on the degree of volatility. as to where I'll deploy them.
Okay. Now, Josh, in terms of the index that the cash consistency, index that we have, we have a consistency rating system at RotoCurve. Again, you want to sign up, join RotoCurve. We have free content every day, live matchup advice, and obviously one of the great advantages is we're really interactive. We have live chats, and all of us are easy to contact, via Twitter and email, all those things. Like, I guess people still use email. But no, and I guess that's the idea. For Josh, can you explain kind of cash consistency and times how that model works, and just in terms of how we approach consistency for cash? Because we've talked about volatility, but how do we approach consistency?
Yeah, absolutely. And just before I get into that, quick piece
Sure.
of news: Paul Pierce is out. Wesley Johnson
Yes.
is starting.
Yes.
Tobias Harris is warming up. We'll get more on his status later. That was from beat writer Chris Vivian Moore.
James Anderson starting too.
Yes, James Anderson starting. But yeah, moving on to the cash consistency thing.
Sure.
For me, is one of my top things in cash games that I know I'm probably on an island here. I really like to look at guys who have been consistent for a long period of time, simply because if the games where people play 30 or more minutes, the same players end up doing the same thing basically a lot of the time, unless the rules change, which we talked about with injuries. And the reason why I like guys like that is because not necessarily of their chances of getting 50 or 60, but their chances of not getting below 30 or not getting below 20.
Right.
That's huge for me, because in cash games, you're not necessarily looking to score the highest possible score. For me, I'm looking to not score the lowest possible score. I know that sounds like a cliche, but
Right.
that's exactly what I'm looking for. And a guy that basically is somebody we've been talking about a lot all season long for consistency is power forward Paul Millsap.
Mhm.
And one of the things with Millsap is the fact that he leads one of our he's one of the top leaders in our consistency tool, which you can find on rotocurve.com, pretty much every game. And that means that his price is not being risen, or has not risen a ton. But the one thing about him is he consistently reaches 35 fantasy points, 40 fantasy points. He plays 30 or more minutes. Of late, he has had a little bit of a minutes issue, but he looks to be back. And that's one reason why I like guys like him, guys like MKG in a short time. There are guys that have been really consistent at other positions as well, like Draymond Green before his price hiked. And looking at consistency for me in cash is huge, because that's one of the check boxes for me.
Mhm.
He's consistent. He has a good matchup, things of that nature. He's a guy that I basically will plug in cash, and that's a guy like Millsap tonight, who's actually next on the board at power forward.
And you have a piece on checking boxes and stuff on RotoCurve in terms of approaching cash games. Really quick, what's the kind of nuts and bolts of that concept?
Basically, what I did earlier on RotoCurve, earlier in the actually last season for baseball, was I talked about certain things that you want to check off before you guys get in the lineups, and I think that's a good thing to look at for NBA as well, because NBA cash games is basically the staple for a lot of daily fantasy players.
Mhm.
We can all agree. I know Ricky's a guy that's been playing cash in NBA for a few years as well, and that's a way that you can kind of grind out a profit. And for me, looking at cash games is huge. So I figured delivering to the readers a little bit of my checklist, how it works. You can go and check it out on the site. As always, it's for free. But I discussed roles, guys that play 30 or more minutes, stuff like that. The matchup, the fact that if they have been consistent, and also you want to look at the individual matchup as well. So basically, the way I look at it for cash games is if a guy checks pretty much every box, he's safe for me, because I don't want there to be many negatives for a guy's game.
So you're trying to mitigate all the risk that you can, right?
Yes, and that's exactly why, going back to Ricky's earlier point, why I don't like volume shooters. Because if they go 2 for 10 and don't get many rebounds or assists, you're not looking at a consistent.
Right. They've kind of hollow box scores. They don't do much beyond 1 or 2 things. Now let's transition into power forward here. It's a top heavy position. It seems like there's some big names here and some high dollar guys. Ricky, how are you approaching power forward? And the biggest question is, I know we referred to him as Boogie, but it's DeMarcus Cousins. And he's always he's the Westbrook of power forwards now, like in terms of crazy high usage and crazy high price. How do you approach Cousins tonight? And then going down in terms of the price ranks, how do you approach power forward tonight?
Well, I actually don't like Cousins tonight. And that's very, very rare for me, because he's one of my favorites. But on the road in difficult matchups are usually bad for Cousins. As we saw yesterday, he almost got ejected earlier in that game because they weren't calling fouls. And he actually is one of those players who averages 3 free throws more per game, which is ridiculous at home, because refs, just they're more likely to call it at home.
Mhm.
And I think that's a fact. I don't think that's a theory. On the road against a Cleveland team that we saw, I don't know if you saw the Pacers and Cleveland game earlier this month, but Miles Turner kind of had a rude awakening. That was the first game that he really had a struggle against Tristan Thompson. Tristan's one of those defenders who I actually think is a good defender. He'll probably get in foul trouble early, and he'll go to Mozgov, and Cousins will have a fine game. But at his price, you kind of need a 35 and 15 type game with the big assists and the steals. I just don't think you're going to get that on the road. They may be getting blown out. He may not play his normal allotment of minutes. So I'm off Cousins. As far as the guy that Josh mentioned, I'm actually been waiting for this moment all podcast. We actually vehemently disagree finally. I am way off Paul Millsap tonight. I know he had a good night last night, but basically he's been battling an ankle injury for like 2 weeks now, and he hasn't eclipsed 40 fantasy points in 6 straight games. So you're paying $7,800 for a guy. I mean, yeah, he's been consistently average, but is that good enough for you? I mean, I'd rather go down. I'd rather go for Julius Randle, who we now know that, Hibbert's out. His minutes will probably get extended. He's got a double-double in 5 of the last 7 games. I mean, I'd rather go that route, or even Kevin Love than Paul Millsap. But the guys that I really like, I think Markieff Morris, you look at DVP, I know Serge Ibaka is one of the best defenders against opposing power forwards, but I don't care. The pace of this game is going to be very nice. Like we had talked about before, I think they're going to find screens and ways to get Markieff open, at the top of the top of the key. He scored 44 plus fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 games. And if I'm looking at this right, his price on FanDuel is $5,600. Is that right?
That's right.
Oh my, yeah. So we're talking about a number 1 scoring option for $5,600 on FanDuel, $6,200 on DraftKings. It's going to be a difficult matchup, but he's going to shoot a high volume, and he's a guy who can rebound and throw in some of the other stats as well. So I really like him. Last guy I want to just throw in there, a big if Marc Gasol sits, I think Zach Randolph is a lock for a double-double.
Nick, what's your take on Cousins, and then following up on the idea of the blowout concept? How do you approach also like the idea when you see it? We talked about seeing big point totals, but what do you do when you see a huge point spread as well?
Yeah, about Cousins, I mentioned I play on FanDuel, and he's a center over there, so he's not even on the slate for power forward on over here. But for power forward, I love Julius Randle as well, especially if he's going to get more minutes. Miles Turner, another one. He's been playing a lot of center when I'm watching the games, but he still lists as a power forward, and the Lakers are just terrible against center, so I love him. And then I love Markieff Morris. If the Suns are going to want to stay close, he's going to have to carry them a little bit, him and Devin Booker. So I love that play. He's so cheap on FanDuel. He'll be a chalk play. I mean, we haven't covered what chalk means, but for the beginners out there, chalk means just a play that's going to be like high owned across the board. Like Kobe Bryant, I bet is like a chalk play tonight. Everyone will be chasing those points from the past 3 games. So I love Markieff Morris though in the cash.
How do you approach chalk? I mean, meaning like it's obviously the context can change each night, each position, but is it something that's often wise, especially in a bigger tournament, to kind of move off of chalk, or how do you approach that?
I mean, you can win tournaments by playing chalk, but you're going to have to play some really outlier plays next to those guys if you're going to want to win that tournament. But so I guess the way to approach big field tournaments is to fade the chalk for sure.
Okay. Now, Josh, what's your take on power forward? And then also, just to pick up on that question of idea of huge spreads, blowouts, does that change? I mean, that is a predictive measure that we can use. Vegas is letting us know that there's a huge point spread in place. How does that influence how you view the value of a player or of a game?
For me personally, in cash games, when there's a huge spread, like I know most of the time we talk about when the Spurs play the Lakers or things of that nature, usually that means the team that is winning by a large margin plays 3 quarters, if that. And in a normal NBA game, the starters will play the first 8 or 9 minutes. In the first quarter, they'll come in at about 6 or 7 minutes left in the second. Some of them come out with 2 minutes left in the second. But for the most part, they get between 15 and 21 minutes in the first half. The second half, they start the third quarter. And at the end of the third quarter, most of the time, if they're up big, they might not come in for the rest of the game. For me, that's tough because in cash games, I want my guys getting a ton of minutes. Now, sometimes there are exceptions. Like, for example, if Westbrook wasn't so expensive in a terrific matchup, he's still likely to have way over 1.5 points per minute. But it's really risky to chase something like that simply because if he's not getting those minutes in the fourth quarter, you're leaving 10 to 15 fantasy points on the table that he could be getting if it was a closer game.
No. with that in mind, are there any games that you particularly target today for power forward? Are there any? Who are the players? I mean, I know we've mentioned before. It seems like Markieff Morris is kind of a consensus play that everybody enjoys here, especially for value. Who do you like at the top of the pricing chart? At power forward.
I talked about Millsap earlier, but I am actually with Ricky now because there is just too much value for middle price guys like Markieff Morris and guys like Julius Randle, who I think is an excellent cash game play because he should start. He should play over 30 minutes as well. So I'm not necessarily going to be paying up at power forward, but if you are, there's a guy that I think will be very low owned tonight, and that's Anthony Davis for sure. Simply because a lot of people are going to be paying up for Westbrook, for Durant, even LeBron James. They're not going to have enough money for Davis, and I think a lot of lineups will not have him, making him probably 8 to 10% owned at absolute most.
Now, Ricky, you mentioned you like Chicago. Anything between Gibson? I know Gibson's been fairly steady. He doesn't have the highest ceiling, of course, and he has no ceiling. But get into Gibson and obviously Twitter's favorite player in the world, Bobby Portis.
Yeah, I think Gibson for me tonight is probably a fade. I think there's too much else out there. I mean, Charlotte not great against big men, especially with Al Jefferson out. So, I mean, you look at them and on paper it looks like a good matchup. 25th in efficiency, 26th in fantasy points allowed. So they're near the bottom. But I like Pau Gasol so much more and I think you're right. Bobby Portis was nice the last game. I think they're kind of extending his minutes. I know Cameron Bairstow got a start a few ago, but he's like not even in the rotation. I just think 5,800 on DraftKings. His ceiling is probably what you need for value, and at that point, it's not even worth it to me.
All right, guys, we have a couple minutes left here. We're going to jam in center pretty quickly, but I think we're capable of doing that. So let's jump into center. I know. Nick had mentioned, on FanDuel, DeMarcus Cousins is a center. So Nick, I mean, how does that affect, it's a different position. So maybe he seems like he's way above the rest of the tier. Who do you like at center here?
I'm not playing Boogie tonight. I just don't think he's going to reach value enough for me in cash games.
Reasons, that Ricky mentioned, just the game might get out of hand.
Yeah, and then the Cavs are really good against centers. They're number one, efficiency against centers. So I just think it's an avoid. But he'd be a great tournament play if you want to be contrarian,
Rudy Gay's playing too.
I just saw that Rudy Gay's playing.
That changes a lot.
Yeah, so that takes some shots out of Boogie's hands too. So
yeah. But
at center on FanDuel tonight, I think Karl Anthony Towns is the guy I'm just going to plug in and move on. I just love him tonight against the Pelicans. The pace is up in that one. The Pelicans are terrible against centers. And his ceiling's been huge the past couple weeks, even though he had a couple down games. But I think this is a great spot to jump back on him.
So that's your building block. Who are you building around tonight at center, Josh?
I think that it starts and ends with Towns or the other center against New Orleans, although he probably will likely play the 4 and potentially guard Anthony Davis in Gorgui Dieng, I believe is how you pronounce his name. But I think for me, Towns, if you do have the money, is a plug and play because he has probably one of the highest floors and ceilings. But in cash games for me on FanDuel at the same price is Pau Gasol. But on other sites, Karl Anthony Towns is a little bit cheaper, so I'll definitely go with Towns. But I'm still just deciding between Gasol and Towns. I might split my tournaments between the two of them at the same price because I do think Gasol has a higher floor, but there's no doubt in my mind Towns has a higher ceiling, especially against New Orleans, who has just really struggled against centers. And the one thing about Towns is in the last 8 games, he has at least 35 FanDuel points and over 40 FanDuel points. Or 8 of his last 10 games, rather. But in the last 6 games, he has something like 3 or 4 games over 45 FanDuel points. So it's just the guy's ceiling's too high for me to avoid.
Gotcha. So Towns is the guy, it seems like that, if we're, at the top of the price chart. Now, Ricky, just in 30 seconds, give me some value you find at center here tonight.
Myers Leonard, a guy who's been really consistent at his low end price. He's pretty much been hitting close to value every night. Not a great matchup, but I still think he plays enough minutes. Enes Kanter in a game where I think they could blow out, their opponent. And even sometimes when they don't, Kanter 1.1 fantasy points a minute. Game should be fast paced. He could push a double-double. And he mentioned Gorgui Dieng, and I want to mention Nikola Jokic, who's gone 37.5 plus fantasy points in 6 of his last 9 games.
All right, guys, it seems like we're against the clock here. We're running down. We've got it looks like less than a minute left. So our consensus lineup, if we want to run across that really quick, it seems like We love Moutier for value here tonight at point guard. Derrick Rose also seems like a nice play, super high volume guy. We've discussed in length how to navigate, Westbrook. As shooting guard, it seems like J.R. Smith is a big name that we like. Kobe Bryant as well, unless you want to fade him for the chalk reasons that Nick mentioned. And then Batum is somebody at small forward. And then the pay-up crowd at small forward seems interesting too. It seems like Ricky likes James, Nick's on Durant. So it seems like there's some cost certainty in those top tiers. And then, we just broke down power forward. And it seems like, that there's a number of guys that were playing there. Who would you guys consider the guy you're ultimately building around a power forward? It seems like center, it's obviously Towns, it seems like. So it looks like we have that covered. And then just to make sure everybody to check out, we have a $500 free roll on DraftKings this Wednesday. And just check with us every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And again, hit us up on Twitter. Our Twitter handles are right here. And we have free, fresh content every day on RotoCurve. So make sure you check that out. And I think we're good, guys. Thanks for this inaugural show. And thanks for everybody that joined us. And we'll talk to you guys on Wednesday at 5 o'clock. So it's 5 to 6, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We're obviously not playing this Friday because the NBA isn't. But in general, check us out.